The blood on the towel had gone brown by the time he opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling of a house he did not remember owning, and then at the woman sitting on the floor beside the bed with the suture kit open across her knees. And he asked her who she was in a voice like a door that had rusted shut. Nora Bennett had rehearsed 9 answers on the drive out of the city, through the rain, with his head bleeding into her lap. She used the 10th. "I'm your wife," she said. And the worst part, the part that would cost 4 men everything they owned before the week was over, was that it was true. 3 weeks earlier, she had been nobody at all. Prescott Memorial sat on a rise above the harbor with its glass face turned toward the water, and on nights when the fog came in off the channel, the whole building seemed to be holding its breath. Nora worked the 11 to 7 on the 9th floor, the donor wing, where the rooms had oak veneer instead of laminate, and the call buttons were answered in under 90 seconds because the people pressing them had buildings named after their grandfathers. She was 31. She had been a nurse for 8 years and good at it for 7.5. Nobody on the board could have picked her out of a photograph. That suited her. The invisible get to watch. She had learned to be quiet in the years after her father died, because grief that stays quiet costs less. Thomas Bennett had kept the books at Halloran Shipping for 19 years, and when Bruno Maritime bought the paper on Halloran's fleet, the manifest started coming back wrong. Freight that never sailed. Containers that existed only as ink when the federal case landed. The signatures on the falsified pages were her father's, or close enough that 3 examiners said so. He spent 11 months telling anyone who would listen that his hand had been copied, and then he had a stroke in a courthouse corridor 11 days before trial, and the case died with him, which was convenient for everyone except the 2 women he left behind. They left behind $214,000 in legal fees, a house with a second mortgage, and Margaret Bennett's kidneys, which had begun failing the same winter and had never bothered to stop. Dialysis 3 times a week at a satellite clinic in Quincy, a place on the transplant list that never seemed to move, no matter how many times Nora called, no matter how carefully she wrote down the name of whoever answered. So she worked doubles, and she ate her dinner standing at the medication cart, and she did not, as a general policy, take up any more room in the world than the world had allotted her. "You doing the thing again," Grace Molina said that night, coming out of 9/11 with a bag of saline under her arm. Grace had been her friend since orientation, a woman built entirely out of opinions and dark coffee, the thing where you make yourself narrow in the hallway. "There's nobody in the hallway, Nora. It's 4 in the morning. Habit. Habits are just decisions you stopped auditing." Grace shoved the saline at her. "Thorne wants us downstairs tomorrow. All of us, the Harbor Light thing. We're clinical staff. We're whatever he says we are, between now and the donor checks clearing." The Harbor Light benefit filled the atrium the following evening. 500 people under the glass, a string quartet on a riser. A bar built out of ice, and a photograph wall with the hospital's logo repeating into infinity like something in a fever. Gerald Thorne, chief administrator, had decided at 4 that afternoon that the caterer was short-staffed and that nurses were, in his phrasing, already accustomed to carrying things. They gave them black vests to wear over their scrubs. The vests came in 3 sizes, and none of the 3 were Nora's. She wore hers open. She carried trays. She smiled at men who did not look up. Camilla Ashford came through the room the way weather comes through a valley. She was the youngest trustee on the Prescott board, 34, in a white column dress that had been engineered rather than sewn, and she had spent the last hour arranging herself into the sightline of the only man in the atrium who had not looked at her yet. Nora had never spoken to her. She was not sure Camilla knew nurses had names. She learned otherwise at 9:10 when she came around the ice bar with a tray of champagne, and Camilla stepped back without looking and clipped her elbow, and 2 glasses went over onto the marble. And the string quartet did that thing where it keeps playing but everyone stops listening. Camilla turned around. She looked at Nora the way a customs inspector looks at a crate that will not fit through the scanner. "Oh," she said. "Well, that answers that." Nora crouched for the glass. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "Don't be sorry, be smaller." Camilla said it lightly, warmly, the way you'd offer someone a napkin. and she said it at a volume that carried 3 rings deep into the crowd. "Sweetheart, the vests came from the caterer, not from charity. Go and stand somewhere the photographs won't have to work quite so hard." Somebody laughed. That was the part Nora would remember. Not Camilla. Camilla was a machine performing its function. The laugh. 2 men in dinner jackets, one of them holding a bidding paddle, laughing the way men laugh at a joke they didn't have the nerve to make. Gerald Thorne arrived at her shoulder with his hand already at her back, steering. "Bennett, let's not." His voice was pleasant, and his fingers were not. "Presentation matters at these things. I've said that. Go and do something in the back, and we'll talk Monday about whether the 9th floor is really the right fit." She had her hands full of broken glass. That is the detail that stayed with her for the rest of her life. That she was on her knees on wet marble, picking up someone else's mess when the room changed temperature. The quartet stopped. Not gradually. A man had crossed to the riser and said something to the cellist, and the music simply ceased, and the atrium did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in rings, the way water settles after something heavy has gone under. Nora looked up. She had heard the name Vitale in the 9th floor break room, spoken the way you speak about weather that has already destroyed somebody else's town. She had never seen him. Damiano Vitale was tall and unhurried and dressed like a man who had no interest in being noticed, and the room had noticed him anyway, and he did not appear to have an opinion about that either way. There was a stillness to him that was not calm. Calm has softness in it. This was the other thing. The flat, patient quality of a loaded object waiting on a table. He walked past Thorne as though Thorne were a coat rack. He crouched down. He took the broken glass out of Nora's hands and set it on the tray himself, and his cuff went pink at the edge, and he did not seem to notice. Then he stood and said to Camilla, without heat, "Say the second part again." Camilla produced a smile. "I'm sorry. You said something to this woman. I heard the shape of it, not the words. Say it again." "It was a joke, Mr. Vitale." "Then it'll be funny twice." The silence went on for 4 full seconds. Nora counted them, because counting was what she did with her hands when they shook. "I don't think I will," Camilla said. "No," he agreed. "I don't think you will either." He turned to Thorne. "Your name?" "Gerald Thorne. I'm the chief administrator of—" "I know what you are." He didn't write it down. He didn't take out a phone. He simply looked at Gerald Thorne for a moment, the way a man looks at a tooth he intends to deal with later, and something went out of Thorne's face and did not come back for the rest of the evening. That was the thing Nora understood about him before she understood anything else. He never wrote anything down, and that was worse. Then he looked at her. "Your clinical staff. Yes, not catering." "Not tonight, apparently." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile. It was the place a smile would go if he still had one. "You've had a bad night," he said. "Mine's about to get worse. 9th floor, 902. There's a 71-year-old man in that bed who is dying, and 4 doctors who can't tell me of what." He held out a hand and helped her up, and the strength in it was casual and complete. "If you can tell me, I'll owe you something you can actually spend." Salvatore Conti had been admitted 6 days earlier for atrial fibrillation, which is the kind of thing that puts a 71-year-old in a good hospital and lets him out again in 3 days with a pill bottle and a lecture. Instead, he had gone gray. His heart rate had walked down into the 40s. He was nauseated and confused, and when Nora sat on the edge of his bed and asked him what the ceiling light looked like, he said it had a yellow ring around it, like a street lamp in fog. She went out to the workstation and pulled his chart, and then she pulled it again, slower. Digoxin. Not on his home list. Not on the reconciled admission list. Ordered on day 2 as a verbal at 11 at night in a hospital with a policy against verbals for high-alert drugs, attributed to a doctor, Adrian Cole, entered by an agency nurse whose credentialing file was a photocopy, and dosed at a level appropriate for a man. Twice Salvatore's weight with kidneys twice as good. His potassium was 5. 8. His serum digoxin level, drawn that morning and never flagged by anyone, was 3.9. She stood there with the screen glowing on her face, and she felt the floor of her life tilt about 4 degrees. Damiano was in the family lounge with two men. The bigger one, Vince Ricci, had a neck like a bollard and was eating a vending machine sandwich with visible resentment. The other one was leaner, older, watchful, Enzo Marchetti, though she didn't have the name yet, and he was the one who saw her first and went still. "He's being poisoned," Nora said. Nobody moved. "Digoxin toxicity. It's a real drug. It's a good drug. It's the wrong drug for him, and it's 4 times the dose it should be. And nobody's touched it in 5 days. Yellow halos around lights. That's the sign. That's the sign in every textbook I've ever read, and there are 11 people with an MD in this building who walked past it." She heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "He needs the antidote. There's an immune fab, it binds it and pulls it out. Pharmacy stocks it. He needs it in the next hour. And he needs someone to explain why a verbal order exists at all, because I've worked here 8 years and I've never once seen one survive an audit." Damiano set down his coffee. "Vince," he said, "go with her to the pharmacy. If anybody slows her down, don't touch them. Just stand near them. Boss. Enzo, find out where Adrian Cole sleeps." They gave Salvatore the fab at 2:40 in the morning. By 6 his rate was back in the 60s, and he was complaining about the food, which Nora had long since learned was the surest vital sign in medicine. She was charting when Damiano came and stood at the end of the workstation with the fog going pink outside the glass. "You knew inside 4 minutes," he said. 4 doctors had 6 days. They weren't looking. He was old, and he had a heart problem. And old men with heart problems get worse. That's a story that explains itself, so nobody checks it. She kept typing. "Nobody checks the stories that explain themselves. That's how it's always done." How what's always done? Nora stopped typing. She had not said her father's name out loud to a stranger in 6 years. She said it then, at 6 in the morning, to the most dangerous man in the city, because she was tired and because he had crouched down on the marble and taken the glass out of her hands. She told him about Thomas Bennett, the manifests, the handwriting, the 11 days. Damiano listened without interrupting, which almost nobody does. Then he said, "Bruno Maritime." "Yes, Cesare Bruno. I don't know that name." "You will," he said, and something in the room got colder by a measurable amount. "Miss Bennett, I'm going to make you an offer, and it's going to sound like an insult for the first 30 seconds. Stay for the rest of it." The offer was this. Somebody inside his family had put digitalis into a 71-year-old man. That meant somebody inside his family was working for Cesare Bruno. And that meant Damiano could not trust the doctors he paid, the men he ate with, or the phone in his own pocket. He needed one person in his orbit whose loyalty had not been purchased before he got there. He needed a clinician who could sit in a room and read a chart the way other people read a face. And there was a second thing which he laid out slowly, the way you set down something with an edge. The Vitale and Bruno families had been in arbitration for 2 years over the harbor terminals. A civil proceeding, quiet, expensive, conducted in a conference room in the seaport by lawyers who billed like surgeons. Discovery in that proceeding was sealed under a protective order. 9 years of Bruno Maritime's internal ledgers, freight records, and wire history sat in a room Nora would never be permitted to enter. The protective order named the parties who could enter it: principals, counsel, an immediate family. "Spouses," Nora said. "Spouses." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're offering me a marriage." "I'm offering you a lever," Damiano said. "The marriage is the handle. You'd be a Vitale on paper, which means nobody in the city touches you or your mother without touching me, which means Gerald Thorne is going to have a difficult year and Camilla Ashford is going to have a worse one. You'd sit at that table when the seals come off. You'd be able to look at 9 years of Cesare Bruno's paper with your father's case in your head." He paused. "It's a contract. It has an end date. You can put whatever you want in it, and my lawyer will not blink. And what do you get?" Someone who's already proven she can't be bought because nobody ever thought she was worth the price. She should have said no. She thought about that later, in the safe house, with his blood under her fingernails. She should have said no and gone back to the 9th floor and been careful for another 40 years. But she thought about Margaret in a vinyl chair in Quincy with a needle in her arm, and a list that never moved. And she thought about a man, laughing in a dinner jacket, while she knelt on wet marble. "I want 3 things in writing," Nora said. "My mother's care, my name back, a real review of my father's case, with real forensic examiners, not the ones the state used, and a clause that says, if you ever ask me to do something to a patient, the whole thing is void and I walk. Done. Done. And done. Though I'd have thought less of you if you hadn't asked." They were married on a Thursday at 11 in the morning at City Hall with Enzo Marchetti and a court clerk as witnesses. It took 4 minutes. Damiano had rings which she had not expected. Plain, heavy, old. He put hers on and held her hand a second longer than the ceremony required, and neither of them said anything about it. Outside, it was raining. "There's a fitting on Newbury at 3, he said. "The arbitration dinner's Saturday. Cesare Bruno will be there. I don't have anything to wear to that. That's what the fitting is." Fabienne Cross had a studio above a shoe store, and the manner of a man who had spent 20 years telling wealthy women that his own bad taste was their fault. He walked around Nora twice with his hands folded and made a sound in his throat. "Something with a strong vertical," he said, to Damiano, not to her. "Charcoal, long line, structured through the middle. We want to quiet the waist. Black, honestly. Black is the kindest thing we can do for her." There was a mirror. Nora had spent her whole life managing mirrors. The angle, the distance, the 2 seconds of grace before you catch yourself. She looked at the floor instead. "Say that last part again," Damiano said. Fabienne blinked. "I only meant, you said kind." He had not raised his voice. He had not moved from the chair. "You looked at my wife, and the first idea in your head was how to make less of her. I want you to understand what you've done, because I don't think you do. This woman is going to walk into a room on Saturday night that contains 11 men who have wanted me dead for 6 years, and you'd like her to arrive apologizing." "Mr. Vitali, ox blood," Damiano said. "Silk. Cut it so it moves. Put her in the color you'd use for a warning, and if you can't do that, say so now, and I'll find someone who can." Fabienne Cross found that he could. The dress arrived on Friday in a box the size of a coffin, and when Nora put it on, she stood in front of the long mirror in the harbor house for a long time without moving. Deep red, the red of something that has already happened. It did not hide her. It did the opposite. It followed her. It agreed with her. It made her shoulders into architecture and her hips into a statement of fact. She looked like a verdict. Grace called her that night, and Nora described it, and Grace was quiet and then said, "Do you know what's insane? You've had that body your whole life. Somebody finally just stopped negotiating with it." The harbor house was on the water in Nahant, low and gray, with a causeway running out to it that flooded at spring tide. Damiano didn't sleep. Nora learned that within 4 days, because she didn't either, 8 years of night shifts had rewired her. And so they ended up in the same kitchen at 2 in the morning more often than either of them acknowledged. He talked in that room in a way he did not talk in others. Not much. In pieces. He'd been 26 when his father was killed on a Tuesday afternoon outside a bakery in the North End. And he'd been the boss by Thursday, and he had understood very quickly that a 26-year-old cannot be respected, only feared. And that fear is a thing you have to feed. He'd been feeding it for 11 years. He said it flatly. He said it like a man reading his own chart. She saw the old wound on the 5th night, when he came in soaked from the causeway and stripped off his jacket without thinking. Under his collarbone, a knot of scar tissue the size of a plum, badly closed, ridged where it had healed under tension. Who did this? Her hands were on him before she thought about it, and then she was a nurse again, and it was fine. A man who's dead. I mean, who closed it. This was sutured by somebody with no light and no time. Enzo. In a car. It should have been debrided. You've got a tract in there that never drained properly." She pressed, gently, and he inhaled. "Does it wake you up?" "Everything wakes me up." Nora took his hand and turned it and pressed her thumb into the muscle at the base of it the way she'd done 10,000 times for patients who had forgotten. They had bodies, and Damiano Vitale went absolutely still, and she felt the exact moment the room changed, and neither of them said a word about it. He looked at her like a man looking through a window at something he'd been told he wasn't allowed to have. She had never in her life been looked at like that. She let go first. She was proud of that, later, and then ashamed of being proud. "The seals come off Monday," she said, "to have something to say. The discovery room. You should sleep. So should you." Neither of them did. The first strike came the following week, and it was Nora's, start to finish. Adrian Cole had a house in Wellesley, and a gambling problem, and $800,000 of debt to a man he'd never met. Enzo found him in 4 days. Damiano wanted to have a conversation with him in a garage. Nora said no. "He's a physician," she said. "You break his hands, you get a scared man. You put him in a room with a lawyer and a chart he signed, you get a witness, and a witness holds up in front of people who matter." Damiano looked at her for a while. "Enzo," he said, "do it her way." So Cole sat in a conference room and Cole talked. He had signed the verbal order for Salvatore Conti's digoxin. Signed it after backdated, because a man had come to him and told him what his debt cost and what it would cost to keep it. A man with a heavy signet ring on his right hand, Cole said. He hadn't caught the name. And then, because Nora had asked him for everything and not just for the things she wanted, Cole said the other part. He had also signed off, 11 months earlier, on a set of transplant candidacy deferrals at Prescott Memorial. 6 patients moved down the list on documentation he had not personally reviewed at the request of the office of Eleanor Prescott, the board chair. In the same quarter that a foundation called Harbor Light had received $4.1 million in charitable contributions routed through 3 shells that ended if you followed them far enough at Bruno Maritime. One of the 6 deferred patients was named Margaret Bennett. Nora read it twice. Then she set the page down very carefully, as though it might go off. "Nora," Damiano said quietly. "It wasn't about her." Her voice came out strange. He didn't even know who she was. She was just a row. She's been in a chair in Quincy for 2 years because somebody needed 6 rows to move so a wing could get built with his money. "Yes, I want him." She looked up. Not just Prescott, not just Cole, the man whose money it was. "That's what I've been waiting for you to say. They did it with paper." The Harbor Light ledgers went to the Attorney General's office and, 40 minutes later, to a business reporter at the Globe who had been trying to get inside Prescott Memorial's foundation for 3 years. Cole's affidavit went with them. So did the deferral list, with the 6 names redacted and one, with her mother's written consent, in her mother's shaky hand, left in. The story ran on a Sunday. It ran for 11 days. Eleanor Prescott resigned on the Tuesday and was indicted on the Friday. Gerald Thorne, who had signed the staffing waivers and the facility use agreements and had personally handled the Ashford family's donation schedule, was terminated for cause on a Thursday afternoon and escorted out through the loading dock, which Nora considered a poetic touch she absolutely could not take credit for. The Ashford Foundation's name came off the atrium in a single day, and Camilla Ashford, whose signature was on nothing criminal but whose photograph was on everything social, discovered what a city does to a woman who is no longer useful to it. Preston Wilder, who had been her escort at 4 consecutive events and had once left Nora at a restaurant table with a bill and an explanation about his family's expectations, stopped returning her calls within a week. Nora did not gloat about that. She thought about it, occasionally with her coffee. They landed the blow. And then the other side hit back, and it was so much worse than she was ready for. It started at the dialysis clinic in Quincy on a Tuesday. Nora came at 4 to sit with her mother the way she did. And there was a phlebotomist in the bay she didn't recognize. New hire, badge turned, moving between the chairs with a tray. She watched him for 90 seconds without knowing why. Then she knew why. He'd tied off Mrs. Adeyemi's tourniquet 4 inches above the fistula. Nobody who had drawn blood professionally for more than a week would do that. And in the tray, under the gauze, there was a syringe already drawn up. 10 mils, clear, unlabeled. And no phlebotomist on earth carries a drawn syringe on a blood draw round. Nora's hands went cold and her voice came out bright and social. Hey, sorry, are you covering for Danielle? She usually flags me if she's out. He looked at her. That was all he did. He looked at her, and there was nothing behind it. Nothing at all, and Nora understood that she was standing 4 feet away from a man who had come here to kill her mother in a vinyl chair. Code Gray, she said calmly to the room. Code Gray, everybody stay seated. She had one hand on the panic strip by the wall and the other on her mother's chair, and she was already dragging the chair backward on its wheels when the man moved. What saved them was that Vince Ricci had been sitting in the parking lot for 9 days out of pure obedience and boredom, and he came through the clinic door like weather. The man went out the fire exit. Vince did not catch him, but the syringe stayed on the floor, and the lab said afterward that it was potassium chloride, concentrated enough to stop a heart in under a minute and leave nothing behind but an old woman who died during dialysis, which is a story that explains itself. They called him Kane. He wasn't a name, he was a service. He'd been used twice before in the city, and both times the coroner had written something reasonable. Damiano didn't shout. He got quieter, which Nora had learned was the frightening direction. He moved Margaret into a private facility on the North Shore with 2 of his own men on the floor. He put Grace Molina in a hotel for a week over her furious objections. He did not sleep at all, that she could tell, for 4 days. On the 5th day, Renzo Fontana came to the harbor house. Nora had met the underboss twice. Renzo was 50. Warm, easy, the kind of man who remembered your mother's name and asked after her. A heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, a laugh that arrived a half-second early. He kissed Nora's cheek and called her Signora, and told Damiano that the Bruno crews were moving on the Chelsea yards and that they had a window on Friday night and that Damiano should come in the long way, over the causeway at 10, because the state police had the tunnel. The tide's high Friday, Damiano said. 9:40 high water. You've got the clearance. Renzo spread his hands. I checked it twice, boss. You know me. They left at 9:50. Enzo driving, Damiano in the back with Nora because he had stopped, at some point in the previous 3 weeks, being willing to be in a different building than she was, and neither of them had discussed that either. The causeway ran out over black water with the rain coming sideways. There were no lights. Halfway across, a van was parked on the shoulder with its hazards going, and Enzo said, no. Just that, just the one word, and the world came apart. Nora would never be able to put it in order afterward. The windshield went white and then gone. Enzo made a sound and the car slewed, and the guardrail took the front quarter off. Damiano had her down across the seat with his body over hers before she understood there was anything to be down from, and the second burst came through the rear pillar, and she felt him jolt once, like a man hit by a wave. Then it was quiet, and the rain was coming into the car sideways, and there was blood running down the side of her neck that was not hers. Enzo was slumped against the door with his shoulder open, conscious, swearing steadily in 2 languages. Damiano was on top of her, and he was not moving. There is a thing that happens to some nurses in the worst 4 seconds of their lives, and it happened to Nora Bennett on that causeway. The panic arrived, and then it went somewhere else, into a back room, and what was left was very cold and very organized, scalp wound, left parietal, bleeding like scalp wounds do, pupils unequal, breathing, pulse fast and thin, headlights behind them. She got Damiano's weight off her and pressed the heel of her hand into the wound and shouted at Enzo to get in the back, and Enzo, who had a hole in him, climbed over the console like it was a fence. She went into the driver's seat over the shattered glass in a red silk dress with her husband's blood in her lap. A man came up along the driver's side in the rain. She saw the shape of him in the mirror. She saw the shape of what he was carrying. Nora put the car in reverse. She didn't look. That was the mercy she gave herself, and she never took it back. She heard it, and she felt it in the frame of the car, and she put it in drive and took them off that causeway at 90 miles an hour, with the front wheels screaming against the ruined fender, and she did not stop until the road turned inland. They went to a safe house in Rockport that Damiano kept, and Renzo Fontana did not know about. A low, gray house at the end of a gravel road with a generator and a locked cabinet full of exactly what she needed. Vince met them there at midnight. She packed and closed Enzo's shoulder at the kitchen table with a headlamp on and told him he'd need a real surgeon in a week. And he told her she was the most terrifying woman he'd ever met, and meant it as a compliment, and she took it as one. Damiano's skull was fractured. She could feel the step in the bone under the laceration. He surfaced twice in the night, both times without language, and both times she sat with 2 fingers on his wrist and talked to him about nothing. The fog, the tide table, the vending machine sandwich Vince had complained about at Prescott, because the sound of a familiar voice is the last thing to go and the first thing to come back. At 9 the next morning, he opened his eyes and asked her who she was. "I'm your wife." He looked at her for a long, long time. He did not look frightened. That was somehow the worst of it. That even scraped clean of every fact about his own life. The man's basic setting was assessment. "How long?" he said. 3 weeks. "I don't remember 3 weeks. I know. I don't remember 11 years. He tried to sit up, and his eyes went wrong, and she put her hand flat on his chest, and he stopped, which she filed away and did not examine. "I know my name. I know my father's dead. I know this house. I don't know your face, and I don't know how I got a hole in my head. You got shot on a causeway in Nahant at 10 o'clock last night because somebody sold you the route." He absorbed that. Who? That, Nora said, is the whole question. The phone rang at 11. Vince brought it in, and Nora heard Renzo Fontana's voice come out of it, warm and cracked with grief. Boss, thank God. I've been calling Enzo since midnight, and then, 3 minutes in, with the delicacy of a man laying a snare in wet grass. Boss, listen to me. Where's the woman? Is she there? Send her out of the room. A pause. 3 weeks. She's been in your house 3 weeks. Salvatore gets poisoned, and a nurse just happens to be standing there with the answer. And then you marry her, and 4 days later you're on that causeway? Another pause, expertly judged. I'm not saying it. I'm saying, ask who benefits. If you died last night, she'd be a vital widow with a claim on everything you've got. Ask her whose idea the marriage was. Damiano listened. He said, "I'll call you back," and hung up, and looked at Nora in the doorway with a face she could not read at all. "Whose idea was the marriage?" he said. "Yours." "Convenient." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." And then she did the only intelligent thing available to her, which was to stop trying to win. She sat down on the floor across the room from him, out of arm's reach, and she said, "Here's what I can't do. I can't prove I love you because you don't remember whether you loved me, and a woman insisting on it in a room like this sounds exactly like a woman running a play. I have a marriage certificate. A certificate proves a Thursday. It doesn't prove a thing about a Thursday." She pushed her hair off her face with the back of her wrist because her hands were still filthy. "So I'm not going to argue. I'm going to tell you what I know, and you can check every word of it against people who aren't me, and then you can decide what I am." She told him all of it, the atrium and the broken glass, Salvatore's yellow halos and a serum level of 3.9, her father's handwriting, Cole in the conference room and the 6 deferred rows and her mother's name in one of them, Kane in the dialysis bay with a syringe of potassium under the gauze, Renzo in the kitchen saying 9:40 high water. "I checked it twice, boss. And there's one more thing," she said. "Adrian Cole told us the man who leaned on him had a heavy ring on his right hand. A signet. He never got the name. Damiano sat with that. You could have made that up," he said, "an hour ago in the kitchen." "I could have. Call Enzo in. He was in the room when Cole said it, and he was in the room 3 weeks before he ever knew my name." She stood up. I'm gonna go and change this dressing every 4 hours, whether you trust me or not, because I'm a nurse and you have a skull fracture, and those two facts are unrelated to the rest of this. She got to the door. Nora. She stopped. It was the first time he'd said it. You said you're a nurse, Tamiano said slowly. When you told me about the atrium, you said I crouched down and took the glass out of your hands. Yes. Why would I do that? She turned around. I've asked myself that every night for 3 weeks. What did you decide? That somewhere under all of it, she said, there's a man who knows exactly what the floor feels like. He crossed the room. She hadn't heard him get up. He took her face in both hands, carefully the way you handle something with a fault line in it, and he looked at her mouth and then her eyes, and she said, You don't know me. And he said, I know what my hands are doing, and then he kissed her. There was nothing sweet in it. It was the kiss of a man who had woken up with his entire life erased and had found precisely one thing in the wreckage that he wanted to keep. He backed her into the doorframe and her hands were in his shirt and his were at her waist spread wide, holding her like something he'd been told he wasn't allowed and had decided to take anyway. And she heard him say her name against her mouth in a voice that was almost angry. When they broke apart, he was breathing hard and his pupils were still unequal, and she said professionally, Sit down before you fall down, and he laughed. One short, cracked sound, and it was the only time she ever heard it. They took Renzo Fontana 11 days later, and they took him with paper too, because that had become how they did things. The burner phone came out of the transfer station in Everett, where Vince had followed a man who'd been paid to lose it. 9 calls to a number in Revere in the 4 hours before the causeway. Salvatore Conti, upright, thinner, and possessed of a rage that had aged him another decade, sat in a room and identified the voice on a recording that Enzo had never told anybody he'd been making for 6 years, because Enzo Marchetti trusted no one, which had finally become a virtue. And Adrian Cole, brought back into a conference room in a bad suit, was shown 11 photographs of 11 right hands and put his finger on one without hesitating. Renzo cried. That was the part Nora had not expected. He sat at the end of a long table in a warehouse in Chelsea and wept and said that Cesare Bruno had come to him 4 years ago with a number, and that a man gets tired of standing behind a chair, and that he had never wanted the Signora hurt. You put my mother's name on a list, Nora said. That was Bruno. That was never. You gave him the routes. You gave him the hospital. You gave him a man's chart. She stood at the end of the table in a plain coat with her hands in her pockets. Don't tell me what you never wanted. Tell me what you did. He told them what he did. She left before the end. Damiano offered, quietly, without weight either way, to let her stay, and she said no. And he said, good. And that was the last conversation anyone ever had about Renzo Fontana. The seals came off the arbitration discovery on the first Monday of the month, in a conference room on the 11th floor of a glass building in the seaport, with the harbor spread out gray and flat below. Nora walked in at 9 in the oxblood dress. There were 14 people at that table, and 13 of them turned to look at her and did the arithmetic. The wife, the nurse, the woman from the newspaper story, the one who was not, by the standards of that room, decorative. She let them look. She had spent 31 years making herself narrow in hallways, and she was finished with it. And the finishing had not been a gift from anyone. She had bought it herself, on a causeway, in the rain. Cesare Bruno sat at the far end. He was 73 and looked like a retired classics professor. Soft gray cardigan under his jacket, reading glasses on a cord, a pleasant lined face. That was the thing nobody warns you about. The architects never look like architects. He glanced up at her and gave her a small, courteous nod. The nod you give a stranger in a lift, and went back to his papers. And Nora understood in that moment that he did not know who she was. Her father had been 11 months of this man's attention, a very long time ago. And then a line item, and then nothing. She sat down. She opened her folder. Before counsel begins, she said, I'd like to put 3 things into the record. The first was her father's ledger, not the state's copies. The originals, the ones Thomas Bennett had photographed and mailed to a safe deposit box at a bank in Braintree 11 days before he died. The box he had prepaid through 2031 because he had expected to be around to collect it, and which Nora had found because she had finally, after 6 years, been able to afford the lawyer to open it. 41 pages of true manifests, initialed, dated, time-stamped against the false ones. A man's handwriting defending itself from inside a vault. The second was the wire history from the sealed discovery, which showed $4.1 million leaving Bruno Maritime through 3 shells and arriving at the Harbor Light Foundation in the same quarter that 6 transplant candidates were quietly deferred at a hospital where Cesare Bruno's name was about to go on a wing. The third was Adrian Cole's affidavit, and a second one, signed 9 days earlier by a man named Renzo Fontana. The room got very quiet. Cesare Bruno's pen stopped. He looked up at her properly for the first time. "You're Thomas's girl," he said. Yes, he was a small man and a large situation. He was a controller with 19 years of clean books. Nora said, and you needed a signature that wasn't yours, and his was available. And he was 58 years old, and he did not know how to be looked at like that. Her voice did not rise. She had thought for 6 years that when this moment came, she would scream. She found that she didn't want to. You put a man's name on a piece of paper and let it kill him, Mr. Bruno, and it cost you nothing at all. It didn't even cost you the memory of it. You just looked right at me and had no idea. Young woman, so I'm going to do it your way. She slid the folder down the length of that long table, and it stopped in front of him. I'm putting your name on paper. Everything else follows by itself. It did. The arbitration collapsed that afternoon. By Thursday, the federal filings had started, and the wire history had gone where wire history goes. By the end of the month, there were 3 indictments with Cesare Bruno's name on all of them, and an asset freeze that took the terminals, the house in Chestnut Hill, and the boat. The Bruno organization did what organizations do when the man at the top becomes a liability rather than a shelter. It went quiet, and then it went elsewhere. And the men who had eaten at his table for 30 years discovered urgent business in other states. He was 73 and alone in a room with a court-appointed calendar and nothing left to trade, and the men who would be in that system with him were men whose debts one way or another ran back to the Vitals. Damiano mentioned that once in the kitchen without emphasis, the way you'd mentioned the tide. Nora didn't ask him to say more. Some doors you close from your own side. Eleanor Prescott took a plea. Gerald Thorne was named in the civil suit and last surfaced managing a surgical supply distributor in Delaware. Camilla Ashford's family foundation dissolved under audit, and she left the city for somewhere with better weather and a shorter memory, and the atrium at Prescott Memorial carried no name at all for a year, which Nora thought was the most honest it had ever looked. Margaret Bennett went back onto the list at her correct place in October and got a call at 2 in the morning in January and was well enough by spring to complain about the drive. Grace Molina became the 9th floor's charge nurse and instituted a rule that verbal orders for high-alert drugs would be co-signed by 2 RNs or they would not exist, and she named the rule after Salvatore Conti, who was so delighted by this that he sent her flowers every year until he died at 81, in his own bed of nothing in particular. They married again in June at the Harbor House properly, with 60 people on the lawn and the causeway shining out into the water behind them. Nora wore red. Enzo Marchetti stood up beside Damiano with his shoulders still stiff in the cold and cried without apologizing to anyone. Vince Ricci gave a speech that was 4 sentences long, one of which was actionable. Salvatore Conti, in a chair at the front with a blanket over his knees, took Nora's hand before the vows and said, "I have watched men marry beautiful women for 30 years, and I have never once seen a family get stronger." And then he said something in Italian that Enzo refused to translate, and that made Damiano look at the ground. The whole city sent gifts. Nobody who mattered failed to notice who was standing at the front of that lawn, or what had happened to the last 4 people who had made her small. Damiano never got the 3 weeks back. Fragments returned over the years. A bakery on a Tuesday, the sound of a quartet stopping. But the 21 days between a broken champagne glass and a causeway in the rain stayed gone, sealed off behind the fracture like a room with the door bricked over. He told her once, late in the kitchen, that he'd stopped wanting them. Everybody else got the man I was, he said. You got the one who woke up with nothing and picked. They underestimated her because she was quiet, and because she was invisible, and because she did not take up the amount of space they had decided a woman ought to. Every one of them made that arithmetic. Every one of them paid it back with interest, and the ledger closed in her handwriting. If this story got its hooks in you, give it a like so the algorithm knows where to find the next one, and send it to the fierce woman in your life who has been made small in a room and has not yet been given her turn. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me down in the comments, was the marriage the lever, or was it always the point? I read every one,